Hello everyone, this is Menz here. I'm going to be breaking down the mouse's armor in this video. This video goes hand in hand with a weak spot guide I have over on my website, wakuru.com. Feel free to check it out if you haven't already. There's a link in the video description and also at the end of this video here. It goes in a little bit more in depth into each area. So looking at the mouse here from the front, you're going to notice, first off, its armor is pretty damn strong. There's no frontal area that is below 242, essentially, millimeters effective armor, going off of the little scale in the upper left-hand corner here. Starting at the bottom, though, most obvious weak spot is the lower glacis, and that is still 244 millimeters effective. Now, that's before you take into account normalization. I don't put that on these images since AP, APCR, they have different normalization values, and then heat doesn't normalize, so this is evident as far as what your heat shell is going to have to penetrate. But more or less AP, APCR is still going to have to go through a crap ton of armor, and even for tier 10 tanks outside of tier 10 TDs, you have a slight chance to bounce off the lower plate, and then tier 8s and 9s a little bit harder to go through it reliably, but it's still the best weak spot from the front when the mouse is pointed directly at you. Now, moving on from the lower glacis, towards the edges here, you actually have spaced armor overlapping the lower plate. Don't shoot this area, it's pretty much impossible to damage since you're going through the 200 millimeter thick spots over here that are spaced armor. More or less moving to these little, I'm going to call them mud flaps essentially. Lower down here you don't hit any hull armor, but higher up here, from the front, unless you're very small or your height is low and you're shooting underneath these actual flaps, which is pretty much impossible, or you're underneath the mouse, say it's on a hill and you're beneath it, you can shoot under these little flaps and hit only 55 millimeters of armor here. It's the last listed value on the upper track area and the lower track area. But actually shooting this area from the front like you see here, don't do it. It's pretty damn strong. You're not going to damage it. The upper glacis, it's still 200 millimeters thick, 55-degree angle, 349 millimeters effective armor. You're not going to go through that unless you're a tier 10 TD or you're throwing premium rounds and you get lucky. Moving further up, these little bits on the front, they're actually space armor. They add a little bit more armor. Really to penetrate these and do damage, you're going to have to go through these plus the turret armor behind it. Because hitting the upper deck here, you can splash it with HE and do damage, but actually getting a shot down on it is pretty much impossible for most tanks, given the height of the mouse. Now, the turret did get a buff recently, but it still has a couple minor weak spots, I would call them, for a mouse, but for most tanks this would be pretty much highlighted in red on a tier 10 tank, but they're still pretty damn strong. Even though they're orange, it's just the mouse's armor is so ridiculous right now that technically they are considered weak spots in a way. So basically on the side, turret front here outside of the mantlet area, so you're going to start at turret front 1, which would be this center area. Turret front 1, excuse me, is the top part here. That's 275 millimeters. Then it drops down to 261 and then 289. So it's pretty damn strong. More or less, shooting the front here anywhere from 261 to 289. Like this gives you a general consensus where these areas are, but the angles do change every little bit. Pretty much just aim in the center, and you're still going to have to get a little bit lucky if you're not throwing a premium round. But for those tanks that have 300 millimeters plus, you're going to go through it the majority of the time. And then right next to the mantlet on this side, not the other side because the mantlet is not symmetrical, this little side here, it varies between 269 and 299 millimeters effective in this little area next to it. So it's still pretty damn strong. Most of the time you're either going to be hitting the lower plate or you're going to try to hit like the center of this frontal turret. That gives you the best bet for penetrating the mouse from the front. Still damn strong. Don't get me wrong. It's just the mouse's armor is actually that good. Most people just load up premium rounds, and unfortunately that's how the game is right now. Alright, so before I get to the side armor view, when a mouse angles like this, I'm going to actually lower this to make it a little bit easier to show. So essentially, you have the 200 millimeter thick armor ending here on the mud flap, and right here, actually the armor is angled behind it. Essentially, it angles down and then it continues, on the side. So hitting this little plate here, it's still thick, but it is possible for you to go through it. Essentially, the track armor is 50 millimeters thick, and really you're going to be trying to hit just underneath this little mud flap area. Really right in this area when the mouse is angled, you're going to be penetrating 50 millimeters of the track armor. And then once you get over to the side here, I need to reference this. So essentially the lower side hole is 140 millimeters here. That's what you're going to have to go through there. They recently buffed that as well. But more or less, you're going to be, this is your best bet when a mouse is angled outside of the turret weak spots, is shooting just under this mud flap to where you're going to hit the side hole and only the track armor. It's still hard for most tanks to penetrate, but it is a viable weak spot. Now moving on to the side, bring up this little image. There we go. So essentially with the mouse's side here, the entire side, isn't, it doesn't have whole armor behind it. So that's why it's outlined in purple. You're not going to be able to damage it if you shoot very low on the mouse. But looking at the side, you do start seeing some weaker areas. The weakest areas are the upper side hull. Here, there's no space armor. It's just 185 millimeters thick. So still kind of hard to go through for most tanks, but definitely a viable spot to damage the mouse, considering tier 8s and up can go through that. And then the bottom side of the turret is also 210 millimeters effective, so that is another spot that's one of the weaker areas on the side. Now, one thing to remember, the side turret, since it is angled, once you start getting higher up on it, 242 millimeters effective. So for your non-gold tier 10 rounds from like heavies and some TD or mediums, not TDs, you're still going to kind of get a couple bounces here every now and then, especially if you're close to the mouse shooting up. Your best bet, is to hit the very top part here, but not the angled section around the rim, because that is angled thicker depending on where you're at. Like this is very thick, you're not going to want to shoot it. So really sticking to the upper side hole and the lower side turret is your best bet, because moving down on the side hole here, you start running into some spaced armor, kind of outlining the upper hole here. Anything beneath that to the bottom here is covered by space armor that's 105 millimeters thick, and behind that you also have tracks covering most of it, which without tracks 245 millimeters effective, so slightly stronger than the side turret on the higher part, and then with the tracks 295 millimeters, so almost, not to say impossible, but very hard for non-gold rounds, non-tier 10 TDs to actually go through the lower side area here, hitting the tracks, and only a small little sliver actually doesn't have the tracks covering it. So don't aim low on the mouse, because you're either not going to hit the hole or you're going to hit a lot more armor than aiming higher up on it. So let's get over to the rear view here. Whoopsie daisy, let me just I was trying to drag my screen over on OBS here. So finally getting to the rear, the armor is still strong. The mouse, it's pretty much one of the best tanks when it comes to armor in the game, even before the buff, but the buff just, helped it out that much more. So these green areas here on most tanks would be considered, usually for a tier 10 tank, these would be like orange, yellow-ish, and, it's still strong for the rear armor. So looking at the back of the turret, 216 millimeters effective, and then it bumps up here to 327 and then back down to 210. So it's weak. Tier 8s might have a chance to bounce off off of them, depending on your gun. You know, but for the most part, most tanks are going to be able to go through this very easily unless you get a very low roll on your penetration. The upper rear hull here, 198, and then the middle part, 161, and then it goes back up to 187. So still very weak areas considering the rest of the armor, but you know, the good thing about the mouse is you're very rarely going to see a actual mouse like shooting it dead on. It's going to angle just a little bit and its armor dramatically increases. It makes it very difficult for you to actually penetrate it. And then basically this little area here, like the lower plate on the front, this counts as spaced armor over the lower rear hull. So you're going to want to be careful there because it does go up to 247 millimeters. And then like the front, the rear hull, this is not the entire rear hull plate. As you can see, it kind of cuts out here, and you're only able to damage this spot. However, it's still pretty damn strong, this lower rear hull area. It's not really worth shooting. You're not going to damage it for the most part, even though the armor behind here is very thin. It's just not worth shooting through the spaced armor, the tracks, and then actually hitting that armor and going through it. You're going to want to avoid that. But more or less the mouse, you know, it's always had good armor. But, you know, ever since they buffed the turret cheeks a little bit, and especially the lower side hull, it's gotten pretty ridiculous. And, you know, a lot of people just throw premium rounds, heat, and stuff at it. And for good reason. There's not too many spots, and these basically armor values you've seen have been, you know, directly head on, flat side, flat rear, and a good mouse driver is always going to try to keep his hull somewhat angled towards his opponent. And once they do that, you're left with the turret weak spots, trying to flank, basically overwhelm the mouse. And if you're not able to do that, like I was kind of stating before, which it doesn't help if you're, you know, in a tall tank compared to the mouse or on equal ground, you know, just looking here, really you're left with penetrating down here if you don't have, say, a heat round to be able to go through other areas or high pen APCR, stuff like that. It's just, you know, the mouse is very large and heavily armored for a reason, and you know, it's difficult to damage. Hopefully this video helped you out and you enjoyed it. Like I said, you can feel free to check out the full weak spot guide on my website, wattguru.com. Link at the end of the video should have popped up here at some point, who knows. And at the video description below, there's also a link at the top of it. Thanks again for watching. Hopefully this helped you out a bit, and happy tanking and killing mouses. Have a good day.